morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Just a little bit about Sacred Safe Spaces. It is a ministry that was started by American Baptist Churches of New Jersey. And what we wanted to do is to equip our churches to prevent and heal our communities experiencing domestic violence, sexual assault, and other forms of violence in our churches and communities. These webinars are to help you to be equipped, to be able to better respond to people who are experiencing this kind of abuse. This first webinar, and we're going to have a series of them, is dealing with domestic violence and quarantine. It's when staying home is not safe. We have Adrienne Simpkins here from the New Jersey Coalition to End Domestic Violence. And I turn it over to you, Adrienne. Thank you.
Great. So good morning, everyone. I just want to thank ABCNJ for inviting me to do this presentation and have this conversation with you all, as it's a very important topic and a topic and work that is very near and dear to my heart. As Reverend Estelle said, I'm Adrienne Simpkins. I am with the New Jersey Coalition to End Domestic Violence. Prior to that, I served in direct service at Providence House Domestic Violence Services in Burlington County, New Jersey, and I'm a mental health clinician by title and profession. And sorry, I'm trying to talk and share my screen at the same time, so I got a little tongue-tied. But I'm definitely happy to be here with you all today and just share a little bit of the information that I have, and hope that we can collaborate with one another to best serve those who are experiencing domestic violence. All right, so let's jump into our presentation. All right, so today's presentation is really going to focus on just the structure of domestic violence services in New Jersey and how we're responding to the COVID-19 crisis. So I know that Reverend Estelle has been working diligently on the Sacred Safe Spaces initiative, and that in that we're understanding the dynamics of domestic violence and understanding who's impacted. So I wanted to share a few stats to get the conversation started. We know that 1 in 4 women are impacted by domestic violence and 1 in 7 men. And I personally think that these stats, or as domestic violence professionals work with survivors, we believe that these numbers are underreported because people aren't coming forward and sharing information. And we always ask about who's actually being surveyed in terms of these statistics. But we understand generally that there's 1 in 4 and 1 in 7 people throughout their lifetime who will experience domestic violence. And this does not necessarily include people who we consider to be marginalized. So when we think about communities of color, we think of people with disabilities, we think of people of the LGBTQ community. These numbers are somewhat underreported. We also know that women in the age bracket of 18 to 34 are at the greatest risk of becoming domestic violence victims. And as we have more access to technology and information, we see that domestic violence is happening with young people, younger than 18. So it's happening younger and younger. So it's important for us to start prevention initiatives and also become more educated about domestic violence and what it looks like, what teen dating violence looks like, so that we can stop it before it starts. And of course, we know domestic violence affects everyone. If we think about 1 in 4, likely we know someone, if we ourselves have not been personally impacted or experienced domestic violence. So when looking at the state of New Jersey, according to the most recent New Jersey State Domestic Violence Report, which was done in 2016, there have not been any updates since then. We know that 63,420 reported domestic violence offenses have occurred. And that does not mean that people were arrested. It's just reported incidents in and of itself, and 52 homicides across the state. I know that this year in 2020, there have been quite a few. One that comes to my mind is a case in Salem County that was a murder-suicide, unfortunately. Even when we think about domestic violence in the terms that the conversation is held in the media, where, we talk about domestic violence being a crime of passion or someone just snapped, typically we understand that there is some presence of power and control or domestic violence in those relationships prior to the homicide occurring. So this is new information that we received maybe about a month ago. The National Network to End Domestic Violence does a daily a census, a one-day census, and in 2019, 1,230 victims were served in one day. And if you look at the chart, you can see what services were provided. So 521 adult and child victims of DV were in emergency shelters or transitional housing. A lot of our programs provide non-residential services, so that's counseling, legal advocacy, children's groups. In addition, there were 571 hotline calls, 265 attended prevention and educational trainings or community outreach events, and there were 126 unmet requests in one day, and 65% were for housing and emergency shelter. So I'll talk a little bit about this later in the presentation, but I think it's really important to highlight that housing is one of the number one issues or barriers to safety as it relates to domestic violence, due to the inaccessibility of sustainable housing and also the large amount of unaffordable housing in the state of New Jersey. So I know it varies by county, but overall we know that New Jersey is a very, very expensive state to live in. So one thing that has not stopped during the COVID crisis is our commitment to serve survivors and children. So as a member of the coalition, I can speak to the work that we have been doing with all of our member programs and community partners and survivors and other service organizations across the state to address safety, health, and well-being of those who are experiencing or have experienced domestic violence. And the way that we do that as a coalition is to provide support to our 30 member programs. So there are 21 counties in New Jersey, and each county has a designated domestic violence shelter and outreach center. There are other organizations that are part of our coalition that provide DV services or are connected to the cause of domestic violence. And so they make up the additional 9 member programs. We have a few culturally specific organizations that serve specific communities of people. So we have Monavie in Middlesex County. We have Waffle House. I can't remember what county that program is in, but Manavi serves the South Asian community, and Waffle House serves the Muslim community. And then we have Jewish Family Services in Essex County, and they provide culturally specific and culturally relevant services. We have Harambe Social Services in Southern New Jersey that serves the African American community. So we try to partner with our culturally specific organizations so that we make sure that we have a well-rounded response to those who are being impacted by domestic violence. So the way that we provide support to our member programs, and this is just general information, is through training, technical assistance, policy development, and public awareness. And so during this time, we're really focused on some training elements by offering webinars, hosting forums for advocates who are providing direct service to survivors, and also technical assistance. So if there are any areas of challenge, especially around housing, we're able to help with that. And then also public awareness. So our social media pages are what we're using as an instrument to get information out about how to best assist survivors or how survivors can get help during this crisis and during this unprecedented time. We've been doing a series of Facebook Lives just for information, general information to share so that survivors aren't bearing this or shouldering the burden of violence in their homes alone. So just really quickly, I want to talk about our special initiative. So the coalition is considered like a leader in domestic violence work in the state. We get our guidance from the National Network to End Domestic Violence. So we have a pretty broad picture of what's happening across the United States in the field of domestic violence. And then we tailor that information to our specific state. So based upon needs that we've identified as a coalition, as a community, as members of different sects of the state of New Jersey, we developed a social change plan that focuses on healing practices, social justice, and connections. Healing practices because we know that we come from a wide range of experiences, and it's important for us to ensure that everyone, no matter their walk of life, no matter the challenges they face, has access to receive a safe haven, services where they feel heard and supported, and also services that help them to rebuild their lives after domestic violence. Social justice, really looking at anti-oppression and anti-racism work to help end domestic violence in New Jersey. We know that the justice system sometimes is not fair in the way that it handles domestic violence cases. We think about people who are not being served, people who are not being seen. That's something that's very important to us, and we've committed to address social justice in our work. And then finally, connections, knowing that it's going to take all of us to end domestic violence, not just one program in one county, but it's going to take a statewide and community-wide effort to really bring this thing to an end. So being on the call with you is definitely an example of why connections are important. We know that faith is important to a lot of people, that many of us have a faith practice, and that's what helps us to heal. That's what helps us to get through. And so again, thank you by having me on this call, because the church is such a critical connection to have in helping to help survivors heal, get access to services, but then also like holding offenders of violence accountable, which I know is a different conversation for another day, but I thought it was good to mention, right? Because someone is committing the offenses, and it's important to address that as well. So I don't know if you've read my screen, but if you have, you've seen some of the initiatives that we have. We have special outreach to the deaf community to make sure that they have interpretation and the same level of access that anyone else would have. We focus heavily on economic justice through a partnership with the Allstate Foundation and their Purple Purse initiative. So we have advocates providing curriculum trainings to other advocates, and also hosting forums for survivors where they're learning about financial literacy, credit repair, saving, how to build your finances, or how to be whole and well in your finances, to be able to move forward and recover from the profound impact that economic abuse has on their lives. Prevention and our Men of Courage network are kind of tied together. Again, there's an initiative, and part of our healing practice is to stop domestic violence before it starts. And part of the way that we do that, of course, is through public awareness, but also engaging men and boys in the work. So if you're interested in the Men of Courage Network, please feel free to ask how you can be a part of that. I see that someone has a question, so I don't know, do we want to hold that to the end, Reverend Estelle? I see a raised hand, and I can't see Zoom.
Hold the questions to the end.
Okay. All right. Ooh, so I'm just gonna, go back to my slides and where we are. So we also provide housing advocacy, legal advocacy. We have social change task forces. So special groups of individuals who are interested in providing access and information to folks who want more information on how to safely serve communities of color, the LGBT community, and then our Allies for Equity group is definitely instrumental in looking at policies across the state that may endanger survivors from those communities. And lastly, the outreach to culturally specific organizations is a new effort that we have with the Department of Children and Families to meet biweekly with organizations that are serving against specific communities. We know that their needs are unique and oftentimes they are underserved or unserved. And we are committed to bridging or closing those service gaps so that no survivor is without access to services and safety. All right, so I'm only going to highlight a few parts of the power and control wheel. I only want to call attention to a few of the parts of this wheel. I know Reverend Estelle shared that this is a series or the first part of a series. And so I don't want to dig too deep into the dynamics of domestic violence, but just highlight some of the areas where survivors are, where certain tactics are being used to further harm survivors during this period of COVID-19. So of course we know that economic abuse is huge. And it's a very large barrier for survivors being able to safely leave their homes. So the ways that we've seen this look are just not having access to the stimulus package. If you filed with a partner and the money is going to that partner's account, and you don't have access to that account, you don't have access to those funds and to those resources. So that's just one example for economic abuse. People have been laid off or furloughed during this time, and so there may not be the income that people had prior. They may not have that right now. And so that's putting additional strain, monies that could be set aside to plan for leaving or to plan to get their basic needs met. Some folks are living in a little bit of lack right now. And so economic abuse can definitely intensify during this time as a result. Using coercion and threats as well as intimidation is major. Just in terms of testing, there are survivors who are not with their partners. So, in a co-parenting situation where a child goes with one parent for visitation and doesn't bring the child back because they're, afraid that the other parent is going to expose them to COVID. If a person is living with their offender, that offender telling them, you can't go get tested, or limiting access to medical care during this time is something that we're hearing has increased as well. And isolation. So with social distancing, isolation is already a tool that offenders or people who cause harm utilize to keep victims away from their families and their support system. So with social distancing, feeling isolated all the more during this time is something that we've heard an increase of support or increase of lack of support for. So we all know that there are certain barriers to leaving, and I highlighted those: lack of money and resources, having a disability, so relying on your partner to care for you, um, children, wanting your children to be safe and have access to the quality of life that they're used to, cultural and religious reasons. Some communities, we know that they have extended families and live together and maybe living, um, not wanting to break that up. Um, Language barriers and immigration. So we know that for undocumented folks, um, sometimes being undocumented is a very scary thing. And so if you're here, if a person lives here and their offender has all of their paperwork, and it hasn't been processed yet, that's another barrier. So being afraid because they may not be able to be helped, fear of being reported to the authorities. And then, of course, a lack of support and resources due to not knowing what services are available and also being isolated. And these are just general examples that I'm sharing that are coming to me off the top of my head. But domestic violence is a very layered thing, and people have different experiences. So, this is all very general information and information that can help you understand a little bit what domestic violence may look like for some folks. So I'm happy to report that most of our services are still fully operational during this time. So our 24-hour hotlines are up and running. We have a statewide domestic violence hotline, but again, those 21 counties in New Jersey each have a hotline. So I'll have a link to information so you can locate the program in your area, so that you can refer people there. Or if you have questions, those hotlines are also available for you to ask questions. Our safe housing and transitional housing programs are still up and running. The coalition is providing additional support to programs to help place survivors in hotels, to keep folks who may be having COVID symptoms isolated, just trying to help programs identify places that survivors/victims can go to have safety. Case management, counseling, and advocacy. We've had to be a little creative in the way that we do our counseling and advocacy. So a lot of programs have moved to remote counseling. So using Zoom and other mental health platforms or telehealth platforms to be able to maintain consistency in services to survivors. And again, those services look very different for everyone, or they look very different per county. 10 of our counties have the PALS program for children, which is a creative arts therapy. So I was on a call with the PALS supervisors yesterday, and they're talking about all of the creative and innovative ways that they're keeping families connected and, sending art projects home, having phone calls. It can be a little challenging with certain people who may not have access to technology. So just trying to find creative ways to keep folks engaged during this time. Programs also provide legal advocacy, a domestic violence response team that goes out to police stations to provide support and information to those who have experienced domestic violence. And then lastly, there is care for people who are perpetuating harm. It's not in every county, but on that list and guide to services that I'll provide the link to later, you can see what counties have batterers intervention for those who need it. All right, so we're just about to the end of my presentation, but I just wanted to talk about some of the concerns that are being brought up, and I think I mentioned them throughout this presentation. Again, things are limited, scarce at this time. So in addition to these barriers being existent, prior to COVID. Of course, you're seeing an increase in a need for transportation, a need for housing, a need for economic empowerment information, a need for testing information. So we've heard that, a lot of undocumented folks in certain counties or in dense counties don't have access to testing, in addition to, right, a lot of counties that don't have testing in and of itself. Again, there are individuals who are unable to access information due to different barriers that exist, or different challenges that exist. Food insecurity, perhaps not having access to a grocery store or having the funds to buy groceries for your family. Law enforcement response. So the courts are pretty much closed, and survivors had the option of not engaging law enforcement because everyone does not want to engage law enforcement. It is not safe for everyone to engage with law enforcement. But now, if you want a restraining order against your partner, you are encouraged to go to your police station to go. You're encouraged to go to your police station to file a restraining order if that's what you desire to do. Not everyone wants to do that. So finding ways to adapt that system, ways to proceed. And I'm also hearing that a lot of final restraining order hearings or other legal issues, criminal cases, have been postponed as a result of this because courts aren't in session. So really looking at ways we can better law enforcement response to those experiencing domestic violence. And then lastly, distance learning for children is a major concern. So parents are now in the position to be the teacher. Online learning is the wave right now, and not everyone has access to technology. If you have multiple children and one laptop and everyone trying to use, the laptop or just a cell phone to get schoolwork done, that's quite a challenge. And so there is a statewide response. We're working with the Department of Children and Families as well as the Attorney General's office to try to respond to these needs. So the ways that we've done that are with partnerships with Lyft and Uber. We've been able to get a couple hundred rides to provide to those who need to access whatever their basic or essential needs are. Flexible funding. So a lot of the funding that we have is supposed to be is grant funded. And so we have to allocate those funds in a certain way, but there's been flexibility in allowing us to just meet people where they are right now and provide those needs. We're coordinating hotel stays. As I said, we have a wonderful housing coordinator who is really getting it done and working around the clock to make sure that people are safe and have a safe place to go. We're continuing as best we can to disseminate economic empowerment information, answering questions about the stimulus, unemployment, providing case management to support people. Community partnerships with food banks and local businesses. We do have one organization or business in Union County that's providing deli meats. And so based upon need, programs are reaching out to us and we're able to provide them food for their shelter and food for survivors. Again, partnering with the Attorney General's office to talk about law enforcement's response to survivors. And lastly, donations and support towards technology. So we had some old tablets around the office that were used for one thing and we're not using them anymore. So thankfully we were able to share them with some of our programs to eliminate that gap for those who need it. So here's a few tips for those of you who are supporting those or may encounter those who need support. We have to remember that survivors are the experts on their own lives and should be empowered to make their own decisions about what is best for them and their children. And I can't stress this enough, that, it's very challenging to, I think we carry our own fears about domestic violence, and we think about solutions that may work for us but may not work for other people. And so I think it's important for us to remember that survivors live this and they do this every day. And while we may not consider it safe, it may work for them. And so we just have to honor where folks are. It's also important to point out that not every survivor wants to leave. They just want the abuse to stop. And so it's up to us to hear them and just provide the information and the sanctuary that's needed in support of what they choose for themselves. So we take an empowerment based approach to advocacy. So respecting folks' confidentiality, not sharing what they tell us in confidence, always believing and validating. It says her experiences, but I'm going to say their experiences because we know domestic violence happens to men. Acknowledge the injustice, respect that person's rights to make their own decisions, help them plan for their future, and promote access to community services. So it's important to, maintain connections. If you know someone's experiencing domestic violence, stay connected, check on them, offer to pray for them, offer them the resources that you're aware of. So if it's food, again, if it's one of our member programs, feel free to do that. And then just for your own self-care, like making sure to care for yourself during this time by sticking to a daily routine and encouraging the survivor to is helpful as well. Oh, we're at the last slide, so we can start taking questions soon. But here's the contact information, and I can certainly send this information to Reverend Estelle to share. But we have our statewide hotline, the National Domestic Violence Hotline, which has a text feature. So if it's not safe for someone to speak aloud, they can text. We have a deaf video phone line available 24/7. I have a link to domestic violence program services, the coalition's website, and also the New Jersey Coalition Against Sexual Assault. And lastly, there are 3 things that we can say to a survivor that mean just so much. You're not alone. I hear you. I believe you. And it's not your fault. These are such important messages to let people know that they're supported. It's not a lot, but just offering that, that non-judgment, being a safe space for a person to share, and offering those sentiments is the best thing that you can do. So I thank you all for your time. I thank you all for your attention. And now I'll take some questions and answers.
So again, we have a question and answer box on the bottom, and also the chat feature if you want to ask. Adrian, we have a question from Eric, who asks, what is one thing do you wish church people knew about helping those who are hurting that they don't typically know?
Mm-hmm.
It's a big one.
Yeah. Yeah, one thing. Yeah, I think it's those things that I shared at the end, right? That just offering a support and a listening ear, right, is the best thing. Like sometimes, like we might offer advice, and I put that in quotes, things that we feel are best for other people, which may not necessarily work for them. So I think, it's just important to meet people where they are. And even if we don't understand it, that we try to make a conscious effort to understand where they are, the challenges they may face, that it's unique. And I think also, as I shared earlier, like people just want the abuse to stop, right? Like it doesn't mean that the relationship is bad all the time. It's definitely unhealthy, not safe for a person's emotional and mental health. But in some cases, like they love the person, they just don't want them to hurt them anymore. And so understanding that sometimes it is a conflict as well. Like it's not just a surface issue. Like there's so many layers, and that the best thing that we can do is just hear people and meet them where they are. So I don't know if that answers the question. Um, that's definitely something that's important. I don't think there's just one thing. But if I could say anything, it's definitely that, like to meet people where they are and try to meet them with non-judgment and a listening ear.
What do you think about resources, having resources available?
Yes. So having resources available, you mean like in terms of like numbers to direct people to or places to
Yes.
focus to? Yes. So if this is not an area that you're familiar with, like please don't feel pressure to like have to answer or provide the services. There are people who do have that information and can help. So having the access to the resources, like I know that this is a place that you can go. I know that this is a place that you can call. Also does wonders.
We have another question from Reverend Valerie here, who says, "Do you think that the church is not as familiar with the signs of domestic violence as they should be?" And let's add on there, if not, are there certain things that people can be looking for as church leaders?
Mm-hmm. So yes, I do think that the church is not as familiar with the signs of domestic violence as they should be. Um, and can you repeat that part that you added?
Oh, I would say if you don't think we are as aware as we should be, which I don't think you would get much pushback from anyone in this group about that. Are there certain signs that we should be looking for or keeping our eyes open for as church leaders?
Hmm. So I will say yes, and that's not something that I provided in the PowerPoint. What I'm going to do is I'm going to defer to a wonderful resource that will help you do that because I don't have the information off the top of my head. But the Faith Trust Institute is a wonderful resource with information about like identifying red flags and warning signs. I will also say I'm looking at a comment from Rose, and Rose is a wonderful colleague of ours. And we've actually, the coalition, through our Women of Color Task Force, has led an initiative to engage faith communities. So we've had panel discussions on how, I guess, in learning like what the church's response is to domestic violence. So we had representatives from the Christian faith, the Jewish faith, the Muslim faith, and I believe, I don't know if we had a representative from the Catholic Church, but we had a panel of faith-based leaders to come and talk about domestic violence and how they respond. But something that Rose said here in the chat is that church communities must believe that members that they hold in high regard can actually be abusive in their home. Deacons, ministers, pastors do abuse their partners. So if we could add that to the, I guess, first question that I asked, and even the question that you're asking, is that, that's important for us to know that people that are in leadership do cause harm, and that there needs to be accountability for that. So, often I think if a person decides to come forward, someone who's being victimized decides to come forward and share that sometimes their word isn't taken as truth, right? And you side with the person who is the leader and or is in a leadership role, and that person feels disregarded and unheard and unsafe within the church. And so I think it's important to believe the person who says that they're being harmed, and follow through for accountability. And I'm hoping maybe Reverend Estelle that we can do, or that you can do a part that talks about that, like what offender accountability looks like.
Okay.
Because it does happen. It does happen. I can think of 2 survivors that I've helped throughout my career, that were married to folks in leadership position and just felt really disconnected and unsafe. Rose also added that couples counseling is unsafe for victims. Thank you, Rose, for adding all of this. So I think, when a person comes with expressing that there's marital distress, like we want to offer counseling, we want to, again, like keep the covenant of marriage together. But it's not always safe. It's not safe to bring them together if there's abuse involved. The reason why is because there may not be honesty and transparency that needs to come forward. There can be consequences. I use that term lightly, but there can be danger that happens to the person if, they're sharing in front of someone that they're being harmed, or sharing their truth, if they're still living with that person, and then, in communication with that person, the harm that can be done to them as a result of them sharing their truth. So it's just not recommended that couples counseling happen when domestic violence is involved. So Hilda says the abuser has violated the covenant. The Bible states that we are supposed to love one another. Love should not hurt. And Rose adds the covenant is already broken once violence is used. So, there's also a spiritual abuse wheel that highlights the ways that people who are perpetuating harm use faith to manipulate their partner and convince them to stay. And so, for a survivor who has a relationship with God, honors their relationship with God, wants to keep and uphold the covenant of marriage, that's the priority. And so we know that scripture can be used to keep a person unsafe, and just emphasizing the way that, God hates divorce, or, the reasons that the Bible says that you can divorce. So we know it's adultery, typically, or when the spouse dies, right? That's when the separation or the covenant is broken, but violence is definitely
And it's
the covenant.
the abuse wheel, that's something that we're getting into more in the next webinar as well?
The next webinar, we're dealing with trauma-informed care, which is specialized treatment for people who have experienced abuse and violence. Sometimes we just think it's okay to just any kind of therapy is okay, but trauma-informed deals with specifics. We will, I'm taking notes on the things that people would like to hear. Yes, so we will eventually get to that. We will have another webinar dealing with domestic violence, which Rutgers is going to provide that. So we're trying to cover the things that you want to learn about, so you can be equipped to deal with these issues.
Mm-hmm. Yes, for sure. So Hilda says, encourage pastors to enroll in a DV program, and also encourage members to enroll in a DV program for congregational support, emphasis, and assist in safety planning. So I know that there are trainings that are provided by member programs, or there's information on the World Wide Web that you can access that will train you about domestic violence. I know that the coalition is looking to offer a 40-hour training online, so that might be something
Oh, wow.
that you can take advantage of. So
And
there
if
are a lot.
anyone is interested, they can contact me as well if they don't know how to navigate these systems.
Mhm. So Rose also adds that domestic violence is verbal and physical, financial as well. Absolutely. It says, please discuss I have a question from Jacqueline. Please discuss the impact human trafficking has on domestic violence and abuse, since many times this crosses state lines. Is there information regarding interstate support and responses? And that's from Jackie from Ohio. There is, I don't know a whole lot about the human trafficking piece, but I know that there are similar dynamics, like that power and control and the abuse that takes place. I can certainly get you an answer for that. If you want to, I can put my email in the chat box for those of you who are interested in that information. Please feel free to reach out to me, and I'll make sure you get those resources. How does a church minister to a husband and wife when both members of the same church? This could be a hindrance for seeking help at the church. Absolutely. So I think from the anonymous attendee who asked that question, yeah, that's challenging, but I think that, we answered the question a little bit about like the dangers of couples counseling together, that you're meeting with both parties individually. Again, that accountability piece for the person perpetuating harm is important. And you help to provide the resources that are necessary. And again, there are batterers intervention programs and counselors who focus on battering, like making sure that, the person who is causing the harm has access to that information. Because if we understand anything about batterers, like the thoughts and ideas and beliefs that they hold about their partners are so deep seated and need, that's what needs to be healed. It's not like I just stop hitting my partner. Like it's, a process of accountability and a process of them, getting their own healing. So being able to minister to that person and their needs, and then also being able to minister to the person who is experiencing the harm. You can certainly, minister to both parties and meet them where they are. But I definitely, again, advise not to bring them together. And even if, that person is in leadership, because it's not just leaders in the congregation that are perpetuating harm. But, if it's sitting people down for a while, or, alleviating some of their duties or responsibilities so that they can focus on their healing, feel free to do that.
I think it's important that churches develop a policy in terms of how they will deal with that kind of situation, because there are numerous churches, unfortunately, that have pastors, deacons, trustees acting inappropriately. And if you develop policies in advance, then you will be prepared when it happens. When it occurs, you're traumatized. Everybody's traumatized. So if you try to plan for these possibilities, it will help you to address it in an appropriate way.
Mm-hmm. And Rose also brings up another great point. Possibly call on another minister in a different church. which is a great recommendation.
Mm-hmm.
Someone who may not be connected to this particular couple, and there's not that those biases involved, or whatever may get in the way of being able
Mm-hmm.
to effectively help. Um, so Tamu Lane in the comments says, I have provided counseling to a first lady that received information that was on their bulletin board of the church. She was fearful, but realized that she needed help. So having information about domestic violence and sexual assault at the church is very important. This help saved her life.
Amen.
So
Amen.
those resources, posting those resources and making them available, um, brochures in your annex, on your bulletin. Rose says, correct, Estelle. That is something that Reverend Morris did at OABC. He is available to help churches work on policies.
And we have worked with Reverend Morris. He has a book that's excellent. Women, Why Do You Weep? Which is a book about domestic violence and the church's response or lack of response.
All right, so Carol Patterson says, let's remember that women are sometimes the abuser. Absolutely.
Unfortunately.
Right. However, I will add that, oftentimes, and there should be support for men, right? Or, other folks who are experiencing domestic violence. We've definitely seen some family dynamics where there's some stuff going on within families. So it takes on all shape and forms. And we also know that, women traditionally or typically are the ones who are perpetrated against most. But yes, women do cause harm. So there is another question, and I think I will defer to clergy for this one, Reverend Estelle, if you don't mind, if I share this one with you. It says, should victims inform their church when they have a restraining order against someone? Should that person show up? And should there be code words among leadership when a perp shows up?
I think that would be wise. If the person who they have the restraining order with, they are supposed to keep a certain number of feet away. So they probably could not worship at the same church. But if someone shows up, somebody needs to know how to respond to that. And if we're acting as a community for the safety of whoever has that restraining order, it's important that they be aware of it and know what to do if the violator shows up. But if they're members of the same church and that person has a restraining order, one of them cannot attend.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. All right, and there's one last question from Hillary. What is the best thing for a church to do if someone unknown experiencing domestic violence shows up at their doors? I'm going to defer again to you, Reverend Estelle.
If someone comes to your church, you try to help them as best you can. I know we had a community cookout and someone showed up. Her abuser stood by the gate outside the church. So our help was limited. He was holding her phone and everything, and just try to encourage her to try to find safety if she did not feel safe with him. And unfortunately, with many abusers, they strip you of everything. So you feel like nothing, you have nothing. And just encouragement, at least in terms of that person trying to find safety. And I always tell them that God loves them and God didn't mean for them to live like this. So sometimes, I know when I went through a lot of training, it says about 7 or 8 times you got to tell somebody where to go for help before they reach out. But in the meantime, giving resource numbers to someone is helping them if they're able to use that. It's very frustrating when you can't help somebody and they're being oppressed by another who they're living with.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I'm sorry, I skipped over another comment from Janiqua. And I know Janiqua does this work as well with educating the church about domestic violence. So it says, I think it's important for churches to know that sometimes that marriage covenant has to be dissolved for the victim's safety, and we have to be okay with that. Many victims have felt a secondary level of abuse by churches who have attempted to force them to stay in their marriage. So I just wanted to share that because I didn't want to unaddressed, leave any questions unaddressed or comments unaddressed. So I think that's all of the questions and answers. Thank you to my family in the comments, to Moo, Rose, and Hilda for adding some additional context to things that I may have left out or didn't consider for the questions being asked. So I thank you all for your help and for deepening the conversation or adding depth to the conversation. Thank you, Reverend Estelle, for your wisdom and being able to speak to ways that the church can start to implement policies and practices to make survivors feel safe. And of course, thank you to all of you who took the time to be on, and for all of your questions and your transparency in asking those questions. There's one more. Oh, that's from Miss Rose. Great presentation and discussion. Thanks, ladies. Yes. So thank you all.
Adrian.
You're
Thank
welcome.
you
You're
for
welcome.
sharing your wisdom with us.
Adrian, thank you so much
welcome.
for being part of this. And thank you so much for coming and speaking. And we'll make sure to get resources from this talk out to the region as well here shortly. I just want to add one thing too is that at the region level here in ABC New Jersey, we take domestic violence very seriously. So I know we had a couple of comments about how leaders and of the church and even clergy can be abusers as well. And if those are not things that are being addressed by the church itself, I just want to say that people can come and talk to any of the associate regional pastors, Eric Hoheisel, Carol Patterson, myself, David Van Brakel, or our executive minister, Miriam Mendez. We take that very seriously. So again, thank you, Estelle, for organizing this as well. So I don't know if you want to say anything about our next. I know you said a little bit about our next webinar as well.
Well, I'd like to thank everyone for coming. I'm looking at the wrong month, the 27th, we will be having Tamu Lane talk about trauma-informed care.
Oh, the 23rd.
23rd, sorry. So we would like you to sign up, and we're going to do this probably for the rest of the year. Every second and fourth Saturday, we will have a topic to talk about, and you've given me more topics that we need to schedule for discussion and information. So thank you all.
Thank you.